Clara Whitfield did not care who the man was. She only cared that he was wrong, and that he was saying his wrong opinion loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. "You cannot possibly believe that the poor deserve their poverty," she said, stepping directly into his path before he could walk away from her a second time. "That is not an opinion. That is cruelty dressed up in a fine coat." The stranger turned. He was tall, with dark hair swept back and eyes the color of a stormy sky, and he looked at her the way a man looks at an insect that has landed uninvited on his sleeve. "I said that idleness breeds poverty," he replied evenly, "not that poverty deserves punishment. If you had listened rather than prepared your next argument, you might have understood the difference." "I listened perfectly well. I simply disagree with what I heard." "Then we are at an impasse and I see no reason to continue." "You see no reason because you have run out of ones that make sense." A small crowd had begun to gather near the refreshment table, drawn by the sound of two voices rising above the gentle music of the string quartet. Clara felt her cheeks warm, not with embarrassment, but with the particular heat that came from being genuinely, thoroughly annoyed. She had come to this gathering expecting polite conversation and mild gossip, not a debate with a stranger who spoke to her as though she were a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. "You have not offered a single fact," the stranger said, "only feeling." "Feeling is not a weakness, sir. It is often the thing that tells us what facts are worth pursuing in the first place." How poetic, and how convenient, since it requires no evidence at all. Clara's friend, Beatrice Sinclair, appeared at her elbow, her fan moving quickly, her eyes wide with a mixture of alarm and delight. "Clara," she whispered, "the entire room is watching you." "Let them watch," Clara said, not taking her eyes off the stranger. "I have done nothing wrong except speak the truth to a man who does not wish to hear it." The stranger's jaw tightened, just slightly, and for a moment Clara thought she saw something flicker behind his cold expression, something closer to genuine irritation than practiced disdain. It pleased her more than it should have. She liked knowing she had gotten under his skin. "You are the most stubborn woman I have met in a long while," he said, "and you are the rudest man I have met in any while at all." "I am not rude. I am simply honest, which some people mistake for rudeness because they are unaccustomed to hearing the truth about themselves. There is a difference between honesty and arrogance, sir, though I understand how a man in your position might confuse the two." That struck something. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time he looked at her not with dismissal but with real attention, as though reconsidering an assumption he had made too quickly. "My position," he repeated. "You know nothing of my position." "I know that you carry yourself as though the world owes you its agreement. That tells me enough." "I have never met a woman who enjoyed disagreement so openly," the stranger said, watching her with something between exasperation and reluctant curiosity. "Most people, when they realize they cannot win an argument, retreat into polite silence. I am not most people, and I have not realized I cannot win this argument. I have simply realized you are too proud to admit when you have lost one. I have lost nothing. You have lost the crowd's sympathy, at the very least. Look around you, sir. They are not nodding along with your view of idleness." He glanced briefly at the small gathering of onlookers, and for a moment, something like doubt crossed his features, quickly smoothed away into indifference. The opinion of a ballroom crowd has never been a reliable measure of truth, nor has the opinion of a single stubborn man, and yet here you stand, certain of yours. Beatrice tugged gently at Clara's sleeve. "Clara, please. Your father will hear of this." "My father can hear of it from me directly, and I will tell him I was right." The stranger studied her for a long moment, and then, without another word, he inclined his head, not a bow of respect, but the barest acknowledgement that the conversation was finished, and turned to walk away. Clara watched him go, her heart still hammering with the strange mixture of anger and something else she refused to name. "Who is that man?" she asked Beatrice. "I have no idea. I have never seen him before tonight. But Clara, you cannot go about arguing with strange men in front of the entire room." "What will people say?" "They will say I have opinions, which is more than I can say for half the guests here." Across the room, her father, Sir Walter Whitfield, was making his way toward the entrance with the particular eager energy he reserved for important guests. Clara did not think much of it. Her father was always eager to please someone at these gatherings, some lord or lady whose favor might benefit the family in ways Clara found tiresome to consider. She busied herself instead with a glass of lemonade, trying to calm the last of her irritation, when Henry, her younger brother, appeared beside her with a grin that meant trouble. "You made quite a scene," he said. "I did not make a scene. I had a disagreement." You had a disagreement loud enough that Mrs. Pembroke nearly dropped her teacup. Mrs. Pembroke drops her teacup at the sound of a door closing too firmly. That is no measure of anything. Henry laughed, and Clara allowed herself a small smile despite her lingering frustration. Whatever else the evening had brought, at least her brother found her amusing rather than embarrassing, which was more than she could say for most of her relations. "Who was that man, anyway?" Henry asked, glancing toward the far side of the room where the stranger now stood speaking with a small cluster of gentlemen. "I have never seen him at one of these gatherings before." "I have no idea, and I find I do not particularly care." He was rude, and certain of his own correctness in a way that suggested no one has challenged him in a very long while. Perhaps that is exactly why he needed challenging. Perhaps, though I doubt he thanked me for the service. Henry studied the stranger for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful in a way that struck Clara as unusual for her typically carefree brother. He does not look like a man accustomed to being told he is wrong. I wonder what brought him here tonight. Whatever it was, I hope it does not bring him near me again. I have had quite enough of his opinions for one evening. The musicians finished their piece, and there was a brief lull in the room, the kind of pause that happens naturally at gatherings when conversations reset and new topics begin. Clara used the moment to compose herself, smoothing the front of her gown, reminding herself that she had come here to enjoy an evening among people she mostly liked, not to spend the night dwelling on an argument with a rude stranger whose name she did not even know. But then her father's voice rose above the murmur of the room, warm and proud in a way that immediately caught her attention. "Clara, my dear, come here. There is someone I would like you to meet." She turned, expecting some minor gentleman, some acquaintance of her father's from business or from the county council, someone she could greet politely and then forget within the hour. Instead, she saw her father standing beside the very man she had just spent 10 furious minutes arguing with, his hand resting on the stranger's shoulder, with the familiarity of someone greeting an honored guest rather than a passing acquaintance. Clara's stomach dropped. "Clara," her father said, beaming, "allow me to introduce Lord Edmund Ashworth, the new Duke of Wren Hollow. He has just arrived in the county, and I have been hoping all evening for the chance to introduce him to the family." For a moment, Clara could not speak. The stranger, Edmund, the Duke, looked at her with an expression that mixed disbelief with something dangerously close to amusement, as though he too could not quite believe the position they had found themselves in. "Lord Ashworth," her father continued, oblivious, "this is my daughter, Clara. She is easily the sharpest mind in this county, though I confess I sometimes wish she would keep her opinions to herself in mixed company." "I have already had the pleasure," Edmund said slowly, "of discovering how sharp her mind is." Clara felt heat rush to her face, the kind of heat that had nothing to do with anger this time. She managed a small, stiff curtsy. "Your Grace," she said, the words tasting strange and formal after everything she had said to him only minutes before. "Miss Whitfield," he replied, his voice carrying a note she could not quite place. Perhaps it was mockery, perhaps it was something else entirely. Her father, still beaming, launched into a description of the family's history in the county, entirely unaware of the tension crackling between his daughter and their newly arrived guest. Clara nodded at the appropriate moments, her mind racing, replaying every word she had said to the man standing beside her father, every accusation of arrogance, every sharp retort about his opinions on poverty and idleness. She had called him the rudest man she had met in any while at all. She had told him, quite plainly, that he confused honesty with arrogance. And now he was a duke. Beatrice appeared at her side again, her expression somewhere between horror and barely contained laughter. "Clara," she whispered, "you argued with a duke." "I did not know he was a duke," Clara whispered back through clenched teeth. "Does that matter?" "It matters enormously. I would have chosen my words more carefully. Would you have? You do not strike me as someone who chooses her words carefully for anyone." Clara did not have time to answer, because her father was already asking Edmund about his impressions of the county, and Edmund was answering with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had spent his life navigating rooms exactly like this one. He did not mention the argument. He did not so much as glance in Clara's direction while he spoke, and for that small mercy, Clara was grateful. But she noticed, even as her father chattered on, that Edmund's eyes kept returning to her, brief and assessing, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to encounter tonight. She lifted her chin and met his gaze each time, refusing to look away first. If he thought she would shrink now that she knew his title, he was mistaken. She had meant every word she said, and a title did not undo the truth of it. "I hope," her father said, turning to Clara with an expectant smile, That you will save a dance for his grace before the evening ends. Clara's throat tightened. I am sure his grace has many more suitable partners to choose from. Nonsense, her father said. Lord Ashworth, would you do my daughter the honor? There was a pause, brief but heavy, and Clara held her breath, half hoping Edmund would decline and spare them both the awkwardness of standing close together after everything that had passed between them. It would be my pleasure, Edmund said instead, his eyes finding hers with an expression she could not read. Clara's heart, against every reasonable instinct she possessed, gave an unexpected and unwelcome flutter. The musicians began to play again, a slow and formal piece meant for couples to take the floor, and her father gestured toward the center of the room with the pride of a man arranging exactly the kind of introduction he had hoped for all evening. Clara had no graceful way to refuse without causing the very scene Beatrice had warned her about, so she straightened her shoulders, forced her expression into something resembling composure, and allowed Edmund to lead her toward the other dancers. His hand, when it settled at her waist, was warm through the fabric of her gown, and she was intensely, uncomfortably aware of every point where they touched. You might have told me who you were, she said quietly, once they had begun to move with the music. You might have asked, he replied, instead of deciding within the first minute of our conversation that I was a fool. I did not decide you were a fool. I decided you were wrong. About idleness and poverty. Among other things. A faint, reluctant curve touched the corner of his mouth. You are still arguing with me. You are still wrong. Miss Whitfield, he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her. I have been in this county less than a day, and you are already the most interesting person I have met in it. Clara did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, and they danced the rest of the piece in a silence that felt far less comfortable than either of them wanted to admit. The dance ended, and Clara stepped back from Edmund with more relief than she wanted to admit, though the warmth of his hand seemed to linger at her waist long after he had let her go. She curtsied. He bowed. Neither of them said anything further, and Clara used the excuse of finding Beatrice to put as much distance between herself and the Duke of Wrenhollow as the crowded ballroom allowed. Well, Beatrice said, catching her arm the moment she was close enough, you have survived dancing with a duke you insulted not an hour earlier. I should think that deserves some kind of medal. I did not insult him. I disagreed with him. There is a difference, even if you refuse to see it. He seemed rather taken with you, for a man you disagree with so thoroughly. Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Because she had noticed the same thing and had no idea what to make of it, she spent the remainder of the evening avoiding his gaze as best she could, though she was aware, with an unsettling frequency, of exactly where he stood in any given room. When her family finally departed near midnight, she told herself she was glad to be rid of the entire evening, glad to climb into the carriage and put the Duke of Wrenhollow firmly behind her. She was not glad. She simply did not yet know what she was. 3 days passed before Clara saw him again, and when she did, it was not by her own choosing. Her father had arranged a dinner, the kind of gathering meant to solidify new acquaintances among the county's more prominent families, and when Clara descended the stairs dressed for the evening, she discovered that Edmund Ashworth had been placed directly across from her at the table. Father, she said quietly, catching him before the guests arrived. Did you have to seat him across from me? I thought you would enjoy the conversation, her father said, entirely too pleased with himself. He asked after you specifically when I sent the invitation. He did what? He asked whether you would be in attendance. I took that as a very good sign. Clara did not know what to do with that information, so she pushed it aside and resolved to be perfectly composed for the evening ahead, no matter what provocations might arise across the table. She spent the hour before dinner rehearsing careful, neutral remarks she might offer if conversation turned toward him, small pleasantries designed to give away nothing of the strange, unsettled feeling that had followed her since the ballroom. She practiced them again while the guests took their seats, repeating the words silently until they felt natural, until she was certain she could greet him with nothing more than polite indifference. Composure lasted exactly as long as the soup course. The first course had scarcely been cleared before the conversation around the table turned toward the harvest, and from there, inevitably, toward the tenant farms that bordered nearly every estate represented at the gathering. Clara had hoped, however unrealistically, that she might make it through at least the fish course without engaging directly with the man seated across from her, but the topic proved too tempting to resist, and Edmund too quick to draw her into it. I understand you have strong opinions about the management of tenant farms, Edmund said, apropos of nothing, as the servants cleared the first course. I have opinions about fairness, Clara replied. Whether that touches on tenant farms depends entirely on how they are managed. And you believe the farms in this county are managed unfairly. I believe some landlords take more than they give, and call it tradition rather than admit it is simply convenient for them. A murmur passed around the table, the kind of quiet unease that arises when a guest speaks too plainly for polite company. Sir Walter shot his daughter a warning look, but Edmund only leaned back in his chair, studying Clara with open interest. "That is a bold claim to make at a dinner table," he said. "I make it because I believe it is true, not because I am trying to be bold. And if I told you that I have already begun reviewing the arrangements on my own estate, with the intention of making changes precisely because I share your concern." Clara faltered, caught off guard. "I would say that is unexpected, coming from a man who told me idleness breeds poverty." "I said idleness breeds poverty. I never said poverty was the fault of the poor alone. There are landlords whose idleness, whose refusal to look closely at their own estates, breeds far more poverty than any tenant's habits ever could." The table had gone quiet, every guest listening now, and Clara felt the weight of their attention, even as she held Edmund's gaze across the candlelight. "You might have said so 3 nights ago," she said, "instead of allowing me to believe you thought otherwise." "You might have let me finish a sentence 3 nights ago," he replied, "instead of interrupting me the moment you disagreed with the first half of it." A ripple of quiet laughter moved around the table, breaking the tension, and even Clara found herself fighting a smile despite her best efforts to remain irritated with him. "Perhaps," she allowed, "we both share some fault in that particular exchange. A remarkable admission from you, Miss Whitfield. Do not grow accustomed to it, Your Grace." The dinner continued more smoothly after that, though Clara remained sharply aware of Edmund throughout the remaining courses, of the way his gaze would find hers across the table during lulls in the general conversation, of the small, private amusement that seemed to pass between them whenever another guest said something particularly foolish. By the time the meal ended and the guests moved to the drawing room, Clara realized with some alarm that she had spent more of the evening thinking about Edmund Ashworth's opinions than she had intended to. As the guests moved from the dining room, Clara found herself briefly alone near the fireplace, grateful for a moment to collect her thoughts after the strange intensity of dinner. She had not expected to enjoy herself. She had not expected, certainly, to feel the small thrill of satisfaction that came each time Edmund answered one of her remarks, with genuine consideration rather than dismissal. It unsettled her more than she wished to admit, this growing awareness that the man she had judged so quickly on their first meeting might be considerably more complicated than her initial impression allowed. She was still turning the thought over when Lady Margaret Ashworth, Edmund's aunt, found Clara near the window as the other guests settled into conversation and cards. "You are the young woman who argued with my nephew at the Pemberton gathering," Lady Margaret said, not unkindly, her sharp eyes assessing Clara with obvious curiosity. "I am afraid I did not know he was your nephew, or a duke at the time," Clara said. "I would have argued with him regardless, but perhaps with slightly more caution about how loudly I did it." Lady Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that startled Clara with its warmth. "Do not apologize for it. My nephew has been surrounded by people who agree with him since the day he inherited his title. It has made him insufferable in ways he does not even notice. You are the first person in a very long while to tell him he is wrong to his face." He did not seem to appreciate it. "On the contrary, my dear, I have known Edmund since he was a boy, and I have rarely seen him as animated as he was after that argument. He spoke of little else on the carriage ride home." Clara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, though something warm and unwelcome settled in her chest at the thought of Edmund speaking of her at all. "Be careful," Lady Margaret added, more quietly now, her expression turning serious. "My nephew carries more weight than most people realize. There are expectations attached to his title, obligations to family and estate that he cannot simply set aside because a clever young woman has caught his attention. I do not say this to discourage you. I say it because I like you, and I would rather you understand the difficulty before you find yourself in the middle of it. I have no intention of finding myself in the middle of anything, Lady Margaret. Your nephew and I are merely acquainted." "Of course," Lady Margaret said, with the knowing smile of a woman who did not believe a word of it. "Merely acquainted." Across the room, Edmund caught Clara's eye once more, and this time, instead of looking away, Clara allowed herself a small, private smile, before turning back to the conversation at hand. Whatever this was becoming, she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to stop it. The following week brought an invitation Clara had not expected, a note from Lady Margaret herself, requesting the pleasure of Clara's company on a walk through the gardens at Wren Hollow, the Duke's estate. Clara suspected, correctly, that Lady Margaret's invitation had less to do with gardens and more to do with providing her nephew a reason to see Clara again, without the pretense of a formal gathering. She went anyway. Wren Hollow was larger than Clara had imagined, its gardens sprawling and slightly overgrown in a way that suggested neglect rather than a deliberate wildness. Edmund met her at the entrance to the rose garden, dressed simply, without the formal trappings of the dinner party, and for a moment Clara saw not a duke but simply a man, tired around the eyes, more approachable than she had allowed herself to imagine. "My aunt tells me she invited you," he said, though I suspect she intended for me to do the inviting myself, and grew impatient waiting. Should I be flattered or concerned that she felt the need to intervene? Flattered, I should think. My aunt does not trouble herself on behalf of people she finds tedious. And yet she seems to believe intervention was necessary at all, which suggests she doubts your ability to manage your own affairs. My aunt has never once doubted my ability to manage my own affairs. She simply doubts my willingness to act on matters that frighten me, and I confess, Miss Whitfield, that our first conversation left me considerably more unsettled than I anticipated. Clara glanced at him, surprised by the admission. I did not think dukes admitted to being unsettled by anything. This duke does, on occasion, when the circumstances warrant it. They walked together along the garden paths, the conversation drifting from careful politeness into something easier, something that surprised Clara with how naturally it came. Edmund asked her opinion on the tenant farms again, this time listening fully before responding, and Clara found herself explaining ideas she had never voiced aloud to anyone, certain he would dismiss them, and startled each time he did not. "You surprise me," she admitted, as they paused beside a stone bench overlooking a small pond. "I expected you to be exactly as arrogant as you seemed the night we met." "And I expected you to be exactly as stubborn," he said. "In that, at least, I was correct." "I am not stubborn. I simply do not change my views without good reason. That is the very definition of stubborn, Miss Whitfield." She laughed despite herself, and Edmund's expression softened into something Clara had not seen from him before, something unguarded and genuine. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the way I spoke to you that first night. I was tired and irritated by half the conversations I had endured that evening, and you bore the brunt of it. You did not deserve that." Clara studied him, searching for some trace of insincerity and finding none. "I owe you one as well, then. I was perhaps more forceful than the situation required." "Do not apologize for that," he said quickly. "That is the very thing I admire about you." The words hung between them, unexpected and honest, and Clara felt her heart quicken in a way she had not anticipated when she agreed to walk in these gardens. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing, and they stood together beside the pond in a silence that no longer felt uncomfortable at all. A pair of swans drifted across the water, and Clara watched them for a while, grateful for something to occupy her eyes while her thoughts settled into some new and unfamiliar order. "I did not expect this," she admitted finally. "I came here today prepared to dislike you rather more thoroughly than I currently do. I take that as high praise, given how thoroughly you disliked me at the outset. Do not grow too pleased with yourself. I reserve the right to dislike you again should you say something foolish enough to warrant it." "I would expect nothing less from you," Edmund said, and there was such warmth in his voice, such genuine amusement, that Clara felt the last of her guardedness soften a little further, replaced by something she was not yet ready to name aloud, though she suspected he could see it plainly enough in her expression regardless. News of Clara's growing friendship with the Duke of Wren Hollow spread through the county with the speed such things always did, and not everyone received it warmly. Lord Reginald Price, a gentleman who had been courting Clara with mild persistence for the better part of a year, arrived at the Whitfield household on a gray afternoon with an expression that suggested he had heard more than he wished to. "I understand you have been spending considerable time at Wren Hollow," Reginald said, once he and Clara had settled into the drawing room, with the customary distance of a chaperone nearby. "I have visited twice," Clara said. "Lady Margaret has been kind enough to invite me." Lady Margaret, or her nephew? Clara felt a flicker of irritation at the implication in his tone, though she kept her voice even. "Both, I should think. Is there something troubling you, Reginald?" "I have spoken to your father about my intentions toward you, Clara. I had hoped we understood one another." "You have spoken to my father. You have not, as I recall, spoken directly to me. I had assumed such matters were properly discussed with the head of the household first." "Properly, perhaps, though I would think a man courting a woman might value her own opinion above her father's approval, given that it is her hand he wishes to secure, not her father's. You make it sound as though I have disregarded you entirely." have you not? You spoke to my father before you ever asked me a single question about my own feelings on the matter. That tells me something about how you intend to conduct a marriage, should one ever occur between us. Reginald's jaw tightened, the first crack in his usually composed demeanor. I am speaking to you now. Then speak plainly, and I will answer plainly in return. I do not think it wise for you to continue this friendship with the Duke. People will talk. They already are talking. A woman in your position cannot afford the kind of speculation that comes from being seen too often in the company of a man so far above her station. Clara's temper, which she had been carefully managing throughout the conversation, finally slipped its leash. My position, as you call it, is not so fragile that it cannot survive a walk in a garden or a conversation at dinner. I will decide for myself whose company I keep, Reginald, and I do not require your permission to do so. I only wish to protect you from disappointment. You wish to protect your own prospects, and I would think more of you if you simply said so. Reginald left shortly after, his composure restored on the surface but his displeasure evident in the stiffness of his farewell, and Clara spent the remainder of the afternoon turning the conversation over in her mind, irritated less by his concern than by the accuracy buried within it. He returned twice more over the following fortnight, each visit shorter and more strained than the last, his arguments shifting subtly with each attempt, from concern for her reputation to thinly veiled criticism of Edmund's character to, finally, a clumsy reminder of the long friendship between their two families, as though sentiment alone might succeed where reason had failed. Clara refused him each time with the same steady clarity, though she noted, with growing unease, the particular brightness in his eyes during that final visit, a brightness that looked less like disappointment and more like calculation. You will regret this, he said as he took his leave that final afternoon, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that unsettled her more than any of his earlier arguments had managed. Is that a warning, Reginald, or a threat? It is simply an observation, from a man who has known you far longer than the Duke ever will. Clara said nothing further, watching him go with a growing sense of foreboding she could not quite name, though she pushed the feeling aside in the days that followed, unwilling to let his bitterness cast a shadow over the happiness she had found. People were talking. She had noticed the sidelong glances at church the previous Sunday, the whispered conversations that quieted whenever she drew near. She had told herself it did not matter, that she cared little for the opinions of people who had nothing better to occupy their thoughts. But Reginald's visit had unsettled something she preferred to leave undisturbed. That evening, Henry found her sitting alone in the garden, staring at nothing in particular. You look troubled, he said, settling onto the bench beside her. Reginald Price came to see me today. Ah, I take it that did not go well. He seems to believe I am ruining my reputation by spending time with Lord Ashworth. Henry was quiet for a moment, uncharacteristically thoughtful. Do you care for him? The Duke, I mean, not Reginald. I think we both know the answer regarding Reginald. Clara opened her mouth to deny it, the way she had denied it to Beatrice, to Lady Margaret, to herself in the quiet hours before sleep. But something in her brother's earnest expression made the denial feel dishonest, even to her own ears. I do not know, she admitted instead. I know that I think of him more than I intend to. I know that our conversations feel different from any I have had with anyone else, but I also know that he is a duke, Henry, and I am the daughter of a minor nobleman with no great fortune to offer, and I am not foolish enough to believe that difference means nothing. Father would not object, if that concerns you. He has spoken of little else since the dinner party, except how well suited you seemed. Father would be thrilled to see me married to a duke, regardless of whether we suited each other at all. That is not the same as this being wise. Henry shrugged, the simple gesture of a younger brother who had not yet learned to worry about consequences the way his sister had. I think you are overthinking it. I think you like him, and you are frightened of liking him, and you are inventing reasons to be cautious because caution feels safer than admitting the truth. Clara stared at her brother, startled by the accuracy of his observation. When did you become so wise? I have always been wise. You simply never asked my opinion before. She laughed, some of the tension of the day loosening in her chest, and though she did not have an answer for her brother, or for herself, she found some comfort in having spoken the truth aloud, even partially, to someone who did not judge her for it. What will you do about Reginald? Henry asked, more seriously now. He does not strike me as a man who accepts refusal easily. I will do what I have always done. I will tell him the truth, plainly, and hope that eventually he learns to accept it, however unwillingly. And if he does not accept it? Clara sighed, watching the last light fade over the garden hedges. Then that will be his difficulty to bear. not mine. I cannot spend my life managing the disappointment of every man who believes he is entitled to my affection, simply because he has decided he wants it. Spoken like someone who has thought about this a great deal already. Spoken like someone who has had a great deal of practice disappointing men who believe themselves entitled to things, Clara said dryly, and Henry laughed, the sound carrying warm and easy through the quiet evening air. The invitation to Wren Hollow's midsummer gathering arrived a week later, addressed not to the family generally but to Clara specifically, in Edmund's own hand rather than through the usual formal channels. Clara read the note 3 times before showing it to anyone, searching the careful, controlled handwriting for some hint of the man beneath the title. I find that the gardens are considerably improved by good company, and I have been informed, on good authority, that you possess opinions about roses as strong as your opinions about tenant farms. I would be glad to hear them, should you be willing to attend. She attended. The midsummer gathering at Wren Hollow was grander than the dinner party had been, lanterns strung through the trees, musicians playing beneath a canopy erected for the occasion, half the county's prominent families mingling across the grounds in their finest clothes. Clara arrived with her family, and though she told herself she was simply attending a party like any other, she could not deny the small flutter of anticipation that accompanied the thought of seeing Edmund again. Clara had spent the carriage ride to Wren Hollow rehearsing, once again, the careful composure she intended to maintain throughout the evening, determined not to let the warmth of the invitation note sway her into revealing feelings she had not yet fully examined herself. That resolve lasted precisely as long as it took to step onto the lantern-lit grounds and catch sight of Edmund waiting near the entrance, his eyes finding hers across the crowd with an immediacy that undid every careful plan she had made. He found her within the first half hour, extracting her from a conversation with 2 elderly matrons who had been discussing the price of silk, with a determination that suggested the topic might continue indefinitely. "You looked as though you required rescue," he said, offering his arm. I looked as though I was being slowly buried beneath a discussion of silk prices, which is an entirely accurate assessment. Then allow me to offer an alternative topic. I have been reading a rather tedious account of agricultural reform, and I find myself desperate for someone to argue with about it. How flattering, to be sought out purely for my capacity to argue. You have many capacities, Miss Whitfield. Arguing simply happens to be the one I find most enjoyable. They walked together through the gathering, and Clara found herself, not for the first time, forgetting the difference in their stations entirely, caught up instead in the ease of conversation, the quick wit that answered her own without hesitation, the way Edmund listened to her opinions as though they carried genuine weight rather than mere decoration for a pleasant evening. They paused near a table of refreshments, where Edmund handed her a glass of lemonade with a small, teasing bow. "I believe this was your drink of choice the night we met, though I recall you spent more time arguing with me than actually drinking it. I remember no such distraction. I recall a perfectly reasonable disagreement about idleness and poverty, conducted with admirable clarity on my part. Admirable clarity, and considerable volume, if I recall correctly. Only because you refused to concede a point that was plainly, obviously correct. I have conceded a great many points since then, Miss Whitfield, should you care to notice." Clara arched an eyebrow, fighting a smile. "Have you? I confess I had not been keeping careful count. Then allow me to remind you. I have conceded that idleness is not the sole cause of poverty. I have conceded that a landlord's own negligence bears equal blame. I have conceded, more than once, that you are very rarely wrong about anything of consequence, however inconvenient I sometimes find that fact. That is a remarkable list of concessions for a man who once told me feeling was not evidence. I have revised my view on that point as well," Edmund said, his voice softening. "I have come to believe that feeling, when it is honest and considered, is very often the truest evidence available to us." It was near the edge of the gathering, beneath a tree strung with lanterns, that Edmund stopped walking and turned to face her directly, his expression more serious than she had seen it. "Clara," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I must tell you something, and I find myself uncertain how to begin." Her heart quickened. "Then simply begin, and trust the rest to follow. When I met you that first night, I had already resigned myself to a great deal of tedium in this county. New titles bring new obligations, new expectations, and I had expected to spend my evenings surrounded by people eager to agree with whatever I said, simply because of who I now am. You were the first person who did not do that. You argued with me before you knew my name, and you have continued to argue with me since, and I find that I have come to depend on it more than I anticipated." "Depend on it," Clara repeated softly. I look forward to our conversations more than I look forward to anything else in my day. I think of things to say to you that I know will provoke a response, simply because I want to hear what you will say in return. I believe, Clara, that I have come to care for you a great deal, and I do not know what to do with that knowledge, given everything that stands between us. Clara's breath caught, the noise of the gathering fading into the background as she absorbed the weight of his words. What stands between us, Edmund, is a difference in title that neither of us chose, and neither of us can undo. But I do not believe it changes what I feel, which is that I have come to care for you as well, more than I intended to, more than I know what to do with. He reached for her hand then, his fingers closing gently around hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the lantern swaying softly overhead, the distant music drifting through the summer air. I do not know what comes next, Edmund said quietly, but I know that I do not wish to pretend, any longer, that this is nothing. Nor do I, Clara said, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a very long while. They stayed beneath the lanterns a while longer, speaking of smaller things now. The weight of the confession settled between them like something solid and real. Edmund told her of his childhood, of a father more concerned with appearances than affection, of the loneliness of inheriting a title before he felt ready to carry it. Clara found herself sharing things she rarely spoke of aloud, the frustration of being a clever woman in a world that valued cleverness only when it remained quiet and unassuming, the fear that she would never find a match who valued her mind as much as her manners. I do not want a wife who agrees with everything I say, Edmund told her, as the gathering began to thin around them, guests slowly departing into the warm night. I have had a lifetime of people agreeing with me out of obligation. I find I have no use for it anymore. Then you are fortunate, Clara said, smiling despite the lingering nervousness in her chest, for I do not know how to agree with anyone out of mere obligation. It is simply not within my nature. I am aware. It is, I believe, the very first thing I learned about you. They laughed together, and when Clara finally returned to her family for the carriage ride home, she carried with her a lightness she had not expected to feel, a fragile, hopeful happiness that she guarded carefully all the way back, unwilling to examine it too closely for fear it might somehow slip away. The days that followed the midsummer gathering unfolded with a quiet happiness Clara had not expected to find so soon after admitting her feelings aloud. Word of the engagement of their hearts, if not yet their hands, spread quietly at first through the household staff, then more openly among the family, and Clara found herself, in those early days, savoring a kind of contentment she had never permitted herself to imagine fully before, wary as she had always been of expecting too much from any single attachment. Edmund called on the Whitfield household with increasing frequency, no longer disguising his visits as errands on behalf of his aunt, and Sir Walter, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of a duke courting his daughter, made no effort to hide his approval. I always knew you would make a fine match, he told Clara one morning, beaming over his breakfast, though I confess I did not imagine quite so fine a one. You did not imagine any match at all, father, given how thoroughly you despaired of me only last year. I never despaired. I merely worried on occasion that your sharp tongue might frighten away suitors before they had the chance to appreciate your finer qualities. And yet here I am, apparently appreciated, despite the sharp tongue, rather than because anyone managed to soften it. Sir Walter chuckled, setting down his newspaper. I begin to think the tongue was the very thing that caught his attention in the first place. Certainly nothing else about that first evening sounds particularly promising, from what your brother has told me of it. Henry talks entirely too much, Clara muttered, though she could not quite suppress her own smile at the memory. Father, nothing has been decided. We are simply enjoying each other's company. Nonsense. I have seen the way he looks at you. A man does not visit 3 times in a week merely to enjoy company. Clara did not argue the point, mostly because she suspected her father was correct, though she preferred to hold the fragile new certainty of Edmund's affection privately, without the added pressure of her father's enthusiastic expectations hovering over every conversation. Not everyone shared Sir Walter's delight. Reginald Price, having failed to dissuade Clara through direct conversation, took to a quieter, more persistent campaign, appearing at every gathering where Clara and Edmund might be present, positioning himself at Clara's side whenever the opportunity arose, and speaking of the Duke in tones that suggested doubt without ever committing to outright accusation. I have heard, Reginald said one afternoon, during a call he had insisted upon despite Clara's clear reluctance to receive him, that His Grace's fortune is not so secure as people assume. There are debts, apparently, inherited along with the title. Some say considerable ones. I have heard no such thing from Edmund himself, Clara said carefully, and I would rather trust his word than rumors passed along by people who have every reason to wish him poorly regarded. I do not wish him poorly regarded, Clara. I only wish you informed, so that you do not find yourself disappointed later. How considerate of you, to concern yourself so deeply with my future disappointment, rather than your own. That is unkind. It is honest, which you claimed only moments ago to value in me. I cannot help noticing that your concern for my welfare arose precisely when my attention turned elsewhere. Reginald's composure slipped further, a flush of color rising in his cheeks. I have known you since we were children, Clara. My concern is not so easily dismissed as jealousy. I have not called it jealousy. I have simply observed its timing, and drawn my own conclusions accordingly. You seem remarkably invested in my disappointment, for a man who claims no ill intent. Reginald had no ready answer for that, and he left soon after, though the seed of doubt he had planted lingered in Clara's mind longer than she wished to admit. She did not believe him, not truly, but she found herself watching Edmund more carefully in the days that followed, searching for some sign of the difficulties Reginald had implied, and hating herself a little for the searching. She mentioned it to Edmund eventually, unable to bear the weight of an unspoken doubt between them. Reginald Price has been telling people that your finances are troubled, she said, one evening as they walked together in the gardens at Wren Hollow, the summer air warm and heavy with the scent of roses. I do not believe him, but I thought you should know what is being said. Edmund's expression darkened, though not, Clara noted, with the guilt of a man caught in a lie. There is truth buried in his gossip, though he has twisted it considerably. My father left the estate in poorer condition than the title suggested, and I have spent the better part of this year working to correct it. It is not a secret exactly, though I have not spoken of it widely, since it is not the sort of thing a man wishes to advertise upon arriving in a new county. Why did you not tell me sooner? Because I did not wish you to wonder whether my interest in you was somehow tied to restoring my fortune through a fortunate marriage. I wanted you to know me first, before you knew the difficulties I carry. Clara considered this, searching his face in the fading evening light. I would have understood, Edmund. I would rather know the truth of a man's circumstances than be protected from them out of some misplaced concern for my feelings. You are right, he admitted. I should have told you sooner. I am telling you now, and I hope it changes nothing between us. It does not, Clara said, and found, to her own quiet relief, that she meant it completely. Though I would ask that you trust me with difficulties in the future, rather than deciding on my behalf what I can bear to hear. I will remember that, Edmund said, and the small, grateful smile that followed told Clara he meant it. They continued walking, the tension of the earlier confession slowly easing into something more comfortable. Tell me about your father, Clara said after a while. You mentioned once that he left the estate poorer than expected. What manner of man was he? Edmund was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Proud, distant. He believed a title was owed respect regardless of whether the man wearing it had earned it, and he ran the estate accordingly, spending freely on appearances while the tenant farms fell steadily into disrepair. I did not understand the full extent of the damage until after his death, when the accounts finally came before me in their entirety. That must have been a difficult inheritance to accept. It was. Though I confess it also gave me a clear sense of the kind of duke I did not wish to become, which has proven useful in its own way. He glanced at her, something rueful in his expression. You have helped with that more than you know, Clara. Every time you challenge one of my assumptions, I find myself examining whether I have absorbed some habit of my father's without realizing it. I shall consider it my ongoing duty, then, to keep you honest. I would have it no other way. Henry, ever observant despite his youth, noticed the shift in his sister's demeanor over the following weeks. The way she hummed while dressing in the mornings, the way her attention drifted during family conversations, toward thoughts she did not share aloud. Even their mother's old friend, Mrs. Colley, who visited the household that autumn on her annual tour of the county's families, remarked upon the change during tea one afternoon. You have the look of a woman with a secret, Mrs. Colley said, studying Clara over the rim of her teacup with the shrewd attention of a woman who had raised 5 daughters of her own and recognized the signs well. I have no secrets, Mrs. Colley, only a pleasant autumn and good company. That is precisely what my eldest said, the season before she announced her engagement. I shall watch this space with considerable interest, Miss Whitfield. Clara laughed off the observation at the time, though she found herself thinking of it often in the weeks that followed, wondering how visible her happiness truly was to those who knew her well enough to notice such things. "You are happier," he observed one evening, finding her in the garden again, a favorite spot for both of them when the house grew too crowded with their parents' conversation. "I am," Clara admitted, "happier than I expected to be, given how it all began." "Do you think he will propose?" Clara flushed, though she did not deny the thought had crossed her own mind more than once. "I do not know. I try not to think of it too much, in case I am wrong, and in case thinking of it too eagerly somehow spoils whatever is happening between us." "You have always overthought everything," Henry said, not unkindly. "Perhaps, for once, simply let yourself enjoy it." She took his advice, or tried to, in the weeks that followed, allowing herself to sink into the quiet happiness of Edmund's company, without constantly measuring it against fears of what might go wrong. They walked together nearly every day the weather allowed, spoke of everything from tenant farms to poetry, to the small, foolish disagreements that seemed to spark between them as naturally as breathing, each one resolved with more laughter than heat. But happiness, Clara would later reflect, has a way of making people careless about the dangers still circling nearby, and Reginald Price, having failed to win Clara through persuasion, had not yet exhausted his patience for other methods. It was Beatrice who brought the warning, arriving at the Whitfield household one afternoon, with an expression Clara had rarely seen on her friend's usually cheerful face. "Clara," she said, without preamble, "I must tell you something, and I fear you will not wish to hear it." "Tell me anyway." "Reginald has been speaking to people, quietly, suggesting that your closeness with the Duke began before you knew his title, and that you pursued him deliberately once you learned who he was. He is implying, Clara, that your affection is calculated rather than genuine, and worse, he has hinted at improprieties during your visits to Wren Hollow that never occurred." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That is a lie. A cruel, deliberate lie." "I know that. Everyone who knows you well knows that. But not everyone knows you well, Clara, and rumors of that kind spread faster than the truth ever can." Clara sat down heavily, her earlier happiness curdling into something sharp and frightened. She thought of her father's pride, of Lady Margaret's warm approval, of Edmund's quiet admission in the garden that he had come to care for her more than he knew what to do with, and she felt, for the first time since the midsummer gathering, the full weight of everything that stood to be lost. "I do not understand how he expects anyone to believe such a thing," Clara said, once she had recovered enough to speak steadily. "Anyone who has watched us together for even a single evening would know it is nonsense. I did not even know his title when I first spoke to him. Half the county witnessed the argument itself. People remember what they wish to remember, Clara, especially when a compelling story is offered to replace an inconvenient truth. Reginald has framed it cleverly. He suggests that your outburst that first night was itself calculated, a performance meant to draw attention rather than a genuine reaction. That is absurd. No one plans an argument in advance hoping it will somehow lead to a duke's affection 3 days later. I know that. You know that. But those who do not know you well enough to be certain of your character may find the suggestion more plausible than either of us would like." Clara pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to think clearly despite the panic rising steadily in her chest. "What does my father know of this?" "Nothing yet, as far as I am aware. But it will reach him soon enough, if it has not already, and I thought you would rather hear it from me than discover it second-hand at some gathering, in front of people eager to watch your reaction. Thank you for that, at least," Clara said, squeezing her friend's hand gratefully. "Though I confess I do not know how to begin undoing damage of this kind once it has already begun spreading. I have to speak to Edmund," she said, "before this reaches him through gossip rather than through me." "I think that is wise," Beatrice said gently. "Though, Clara, I fear it may already be too late for that." Clara spent the remainder of that evening pacing her bedroom, rehearsing what she might say, trying to anticipate every possible response Edmund might have to the rumors before she had even confirmed whether he had heard them. She thought of writing a letter, then dismissed the idea as cowardly, unworthy of the honesty she had always demanded of herself and of him. Whatever needed saying would be said to his face, plainly, the way she had always spoken to him since the very first night of their acquaintance. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake long past midnight, listening to the house settle around her, turning over every possible way the conversation might unfold, and by the time dawn finally broke over the fields beyond her window, she had convinced herself of nothing, except that waiting any longer would only make the difficulty worse. Beatrice's fear proved well-founded. By the time Clara arrived at Wren Hollow the following morning, having sent word ahead that she needed to speak with Edmund urgently, The rumor had already reached the household through the mouths of servants who had heard it whispered at the market, through a letter delivered to Lady Margaret from a concerned acquaintance, through the particular swiftness with which unkind stories always seem to travel faster than kind ones. Edmund met her in the drawing room, his expression tight and unreadable in a way that struck fear into Clara's heart before either of them had spoken a single word. "You have heard, then," she said. "I have heard a great many things this morning, none of which I wish to hear, and none of which I know how to reconcile with the woman I believed I knew." Clara's stomach twisted at the coldness in his voice, so unlike the warmth she had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. "Edmund, whatever you have heard, it is not true. Reginald Price has invented these stories out of spite, because I refused his affections and chose to spend my time with you instead. That is a convenient explanation. It is the true explanation, whether or not it is convenient. And yet it arrives so precisely when it is needed, does it not? An explanation that absolves you entirely, and places the blame on a man who has no opportunity to defend himself in this conversation. I am not asking you to condemn Reginald without evidence. I am asking you to trust the evidence of your own eyes and ears, gathered over the past weeks, above the whispered claims of a man who has made no secret of his resentment toward our friendship. Feelings are not evidence, Clara. You told me so yourself, on the very first night we met, though I confess I did not expect the lesson to return to trouble me quite so soon. The reference to their first argument stung more than Clara expected, twisted now into something cruel rather than the fond memory it had become between them. Do not use my own words against me, as though they were a weapon, Edmund. I meant them honestly then, and I mean this honestly now. Who told you these things? Clara asked, before he could continue. I would know the source of whatever poison has found its way to your ears. Does it matter who spoke the words if part of me finds myself unable to dismiss them entirely? It matters a great deal, because the person who spoke them has every reason to wish us parted, and none whatsoever to wish us well. Edmund's expression flickered, something uncertain passing behind his eyes. Lord Price called on my aunt yesterday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a matter of local business. He mentioned, in the course of conversation, certain concerns about the nature of your interest in me. My aunt dismissed it outright, but the words had already been said, and I confess they lodged themselves somewhere I have not managed to dislodge them since. So the source is exactly the man I warned you might attempt something of this nature, weeks ago in your own garden. Does that revelation not trouble you at all? It troubles me considerably, and yet the doubt remains, however unreasonable its source may be. Edmund began to pace, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, and Clara watched him with mounting desperation, unable to understand how quickly the ground beneath them had shifted. I have spent my entire life since inheriting this title, being told what people want from me, being courted for my position rather than myself. I told myself you were different. I told my aunt you were different. And now I hear whispers that you pursued this connection deliberately, that you calculated every argument, every clever remark, in order to secure exactly the outcome that has occurred. You cannot believe that. I do not know what I believe, Clara. That is precisely the difficulty. Something in Clara broke then, the careful patience she had maintained through the entire journey to Wren Hollow finally giving way to something closer to the fire that had first drawn Edmund's attention on the night they met. Then you know me far less than I believed you did, if a handful of whispered lies is enough to undo everything we have built between us. I did not calculate anything. I argued with you before I knew your name because I believed what I said, not because I hoped to catch the attention of a duke. If you cannot see the difference between that truth and Reginald's poisonous fabrication, then perhaps you never truly understood me at all. Do not raise your voice at me in my own home. I will raise my voice wherever I please, when I am being accused of dishonesty by the very man who once told me he admired my honesty above everything else. You claimed you wanted someone who would argue with you rather than simply agree. Here I am, arguing, and you have decided the argument itself is proof of some hidden scheme. Edmund stopped pacing, his expression conflicted, torn between the anger that had gripped him since the morning's revelations and something softer that Clara's words had clearly disturbed. I do not wish to believe it, he admitted quietly. But the doubt has been planted, and I find I cannot simply will it away. Then let it grow if you wish, and destroy whatever we have built. Or trust me, as you asked me to trust you when you told me of your family's debts, and let this pass the way it deserves to pass, as nothing more than a jealous man's cruelty. The room fell silent, the tension between them thick enough to touch, and Clara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall in front of him now, not when he had made her doubt so completely everything she had believed about his feelings for her. "I need time," Edmund said finally, his voice quieter now, though no less troubled. "I need to think, away from your presence, and away from the whispers both, so that I might understand my own mind clearly." Clara felt the words like a physical blow, worse in some ways than outright rejection, because it left the outcome uncertain, dangling, painful in its ambiguity. "Very well," she said, gathering what remained of her composure. "Take whatever time you require, Your Grace. I will not trouble you further until you have decided what you believe of me." She left Wren Hollow that morning without seeing Lady Margaret, without waiting for a carriage, walking instead along the country road until Beatrice's own carriage happened upon her, and carried her the rest of the way home in a silence broken only by the occasional, helpless sound of Clara's tears finally escaping despite her best efforts to contain them. Beatrice did not press her for details, understanding instinctively that Clara needed silence more than conversation, and it was not until they had nearly reached the Whitfield house that Clara finally spoke, her voice hoarse from the effort of holding back tears for so long. "He asked me to give him time," she said, as though time were the difficulty, rather than his willingness to believe a stranger's lies over the truth I had given him myself. "Perhaps time is exactly what he needs, Clara. Doubt, once planted, does not always uproot itself quickly, even when the person holding it wishes it gone. I do not have patience for doubt. I have never had patience for it, in myself or in anyone else." "I know," Beatrice said gently, taking her friend's hand. "But love sometimes requires a patience we do not naturally possess. Perhaps this is simply one of those times." Clara said nothing further, staring out at the passing fields, wondering whether her friend was right, and hating, more than anything, how helpless she felt in the face of a doubt she could not argue away no matter how forcefully she tried. The days that followed were among the darkest Clara had known. She kept to the house, declining invitations, avoiding even Henry's gentle attempts at comfort, replaying the conversation with Edmund over and over in her mind, searching for some way she might have handled it differently, some words that might have reached him before doubt had taken such firm root. Her father, sensing something had gone terribly wrong but unable to draw the details from his daughter, grew increasingly worried, and even Beatrice's usual cheerfulness could not coax more than a hollow smile from Clara during her visits. On the third day, Sir Walter finally cornered his daughter in the hallway, his usual jovial manner replaced by something more serious than Clara had seen from him in years. "I have heard talk," he said quietly, "of rumors concerning you and Lord Ashworth. I did not wish to trouble you with it while you were already so clearly unwell, but I can no longer pretend I have not noticed your suffering, Clara, and I would know the truth of what has happened between you." Clara, too weary to maintain her usual reserve, told him everything. The rumors Reginald had spread, the confrontation at Wren Hollow, Edmund's request for time to think, the silence that had stretched between them ever since. Her father listened without interruption, his expression growing steadily more troubled as the account unfolded. "Reginald Price," he said finally, his voice tight with anger she had rarely heard from him, "will answer to me for this, regardless of whatever answer he owes to you, or to Lord Ashworth. Father, please. Confronting him will only give the rumors more attention, not less. I cannot simply do nothing, Clara, while a man spreads lies about my daughter's character to protect his own wounded pride. Then trust me to manage it myself, as I have managed everything else in my life that required managing. I do not need you to fight this battle for me. I need only your patience, while I determine how best to fight it myself." Sir Walter studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant respect crossing his weathered features. "You are your mother's daughter in every particular," he said finally. She, too, insisted on fighting her own battles, whatever the cost to her pride in accepting help. "Very well. I will hold my tongue, for now, though I make no promise of indefinite patience should the situation fail to resolve itself." "That is all I ask," Clara said, and for the first time in days, she felt a small measure of comfort in having spoken the truth aloud to someone who loved her without condition. On the fourth day, unable to bear the waiting any longer, Clara resolved to confront Reginald directly, whatever discomfort or scandal might follow from doing so. She found him at the small assembly rooms in the village, engaged in idle conversation with a group of gentlemen who scattered quickly at the sight of her approach, sensing, perhaps, the tension radiating from her rigid posture. "Clara," Reginald said, his composure faltering slightly at her sudden appearance, "I had not expected to see you today." "I imagine not, given how carefully you have avoided me since spreading lies about my character throughout the entire county. I have said nothing that was not rooted in genuine concern for—" "Do not," Clara interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. Insult me further by pretending this was ever about concern. You have told people I calculated my affection for Lord Ashworth, that I pursued him deliberately once I learned his title, that improprieties occurred during my visits to his home. Every word of it is false, and you know it to be false, because you have known me long enough to understand I am incapable of such calculation. Reginald's face reddened, though whether from shame or anger, Clara could not tell. I only wish to protect you from a match that would inevitably end in your disappointment. You wish to protect your own pride, which could not accept being refused in favor of another man. I understand disappointment, Reginald. I do not understand cruelty, and what you have done is nothing less than cruel. I did not intend. It does not matter what you intended. It matters what you have done, and what you have done is threatened to destroy something precious to me out of nothing more than wounded vanity. I will not forgive it easily, and I do not believe Lord Ashworth will either, once the truth of your involvement becomes fully known, as I intend to ensure it does. She left him standing there, pale and silent, and though the confrontation brought her little immediate comfort, she felt, walking away, a small return of the fire that had first drawn Edmund's attention on the night they met, the certainty that she would not simply accept injustice without at least attempting to answer it. It was Henry, in the end, who took matters further into his own hands. Without telling Clara, he rode to Wren Hollow himself, requesting an audience with the Duke through means that surprised even Lady Margaret, who admitted him readily once she understood the purpose of his visit. You are a fool, Henry said, once he stood before Edmund in the same drawing room where Clara had faced him days earlier. If you believe for one moment that my sister calculated anything about her feelings for you, I have known her my entire life. I have watched her champion causes that gained her nothing but trouble, defend people who could offer her no benefit in return, argue against her own interests simply because she believed she was right. She does not know how to be calculating, Your Grace, even when it might serve her well to try. Edmund studied the young man before him, surprised by the boldness of the visit. You came here to defend her. I came here because she is miserable, and because I believe you are miserable as well, and because I think you are both too proud to admit that a jealous man's lies have accomplished exactly what he intended. Reginald Price wanted to separate you. From what I can see, he has succeeded, and neither of you seems inclined to fight against it. It is not so simple as fighting. It is exactly that simple, Henry said, with the blunt certainty of youth. You either believe her, or you do not. If you do not, then let her go entirely, and stop causing her further pain by leaving the matter unresolved. But if you do believe her, Your Grace, then ride to our house today, and tell her so, before pride costs you both something you will regret for the rest of your lives. Edmund said nothing for a long moment, staring at the younger man with an expression Henry could not quite read. Then, slowly, something shifted in his face, the tight, guarded anger of the past days giving way to something closer to shame. I have been a fool, he said quietly. Yes, Henry agreed, you have. Fortunately, it is not yet too late to stop being one. Lady Margaret, who had been listening from the doorway without either young man noticing, stepped into the room with the satisfied expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this outcome. Well, Edmund, what are you waiting for? Edmund looked between his aunt and Henry, and for the first time in days, something like hope flickered across his features. Nothing, he said. I am waiting for nothing at all. He called for his horse before Henry had even finished his tea, leaving Lady Margaret and Henry to exchange a look of mutual satisfaction as the sound of hoofbeats faded rapidly down the drive. He will make a fine husband for her, I think, Lady Margaret said, settling into a chair with the contentment of a woman who had spent weeks quietly engineering exactly this outcome. Once he learns, fully, to trust his own judgment over the whispered doubts of lesser men. He seemed to learn that lesson rather quickly, once someone finally spoke plainly to him, Henry observed, not without a note of pride. Some lessons require nothing more than the right person willing to speak them aloud. You did your sister a great service today, young man, whether or not she ever learns the full extent of your involvement. Oh, she will learn of it, Henry said, grinning. I intend to remind her of it for years to come, whenever she requires humbling. Lady Margaret laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and the two of them sat together a while longer, speculating happily on what the coming hours might bring, while Edmund rode as fast as his horse would carry him toward the house where Clara waited, unaware that her fortunes were about to change entirely for the better. Clara was sitting in the garden, the same bench where Henry had found her weeks earlier during happier days, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at a pace far too urgent for a casual visit. She looked up, half expecting some emergency, and felt her heart stop entirely when she recognized the rider. Edmund dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, crossing the distance between them with long, determined strides, and Clara rose from the bench uncertain whether to feel hope or fear at the sight of him. "I have been a fool," he said, before she could speak a single word. "A proud, doubting fool who allowed a jealous man's lies to poison something far more precious than my own comfort. I should never have doubted you, Clara. I knew you, from the very first night we argued, to be honest, to the point of recklessness. I knew you cared nothing for titles or fortune when you spoke to me as though I were simply a man who happened to be wrong about idleness and poverty. And yet when doubt was placed in front of me, I let it override everything I already knew to be true." Clara's breath caught, hope rising despite her best efforts to guard against it. "What changed your mind?" "Your brother," Edmund admitted, with a faint, rueful smile. "He rode to Wren Hollow this morning and told me, in no uncertain terms, that I was causing you pain through my own cowardice, and that if I truly believed in you, I owed you the courage to say so, rather than hiding behind wounded pride." "Henry did that?" "He did, and he was entirely correct to do so." Edmund closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his own with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the urgency of his arrival. "Clara, I do not care what Reginald Price has whispered to anyone who will listen. I do not care what doubts he has tried to plant, or what damage his jealousy has attempted to inflict upon us. I care only that I have spent the worst days of my life these past few, separated from you by nothing more substantial than my own foolish pride, and I do not intend to spend a single day more that way if I can help it." Tears filled Clara's eyes, though this time they carried relief rather than sorrow. "I was so afraid," she admitted, "that you had chosen to believe him over me. I chose fear over faith, for a few terrible days, and I will regret it for a long while yet. But I choose you now, Clara, entirely and without reservation, and I intend to spend whatever time you will allow me, proving that choice was not made lightly." Before Clara could respond, the sound of footsteps announced her father's arrival at the edge of the garden, drawn by the commotion of a duke's sudden and dramatic appearance. Sir Walter took one look at the scene before him, his daughter's tear-streaked but hopeful face, the Duke of Wren Hollow holding her hands with obvious devotion, and wisely chose to say nothing, retreating quietly back toward the house with the barely contained excitement of a man who suspected he was about to witness something momentous. "There remains the matter of Reginald Price," Clara said, once her father had gone, some part of her still troubled by the injustice of it. "He has spread lies about my character to half the county. I cannot simply allow that to stand unanswered." "You will not have to," Edmund said, his expression turning grim with resolve. "I intend to make plain, publicly and unequivocally, that his claims were fabrications born of jealousy, and that any further attempt to damage your reputation will be met with consequences he will find considerably unpleasant. A man of my position has some influence in this county, Clara, and I do not intend to let it sit unused while your good name is dragged through gossip you did nothing to deserve." "You confronted him yourself, I understand," Edmund said, once the immediate relief of reconciliation had settled into something steadier. "My aunt mentioned it, though she would not tell me the particulars." "I could not simply wait for others to defend me," Clara said. "I told him plainly what I thought of his behavior, and I do not regret a single word of it, whatever consequences may follow." "You are entirely remarkable, do you know that? Most people, faced with rumors of that nature, retreat into silence and hope the storm passes on its own. I have never been most people. I thought you understood that about me by now." "I understood it from the very first night," Edmund said, smiling. "I simply required a rather painful reminder of how much I valued it. Once fear convinced me to doubt it instead." True to his word, Edmund arranged for the truth to be known within days, speaking plainly at the next gathering of note about the baseless nature of Reginald's claims, and making it clear, through both his words and his evident devotion to Clara, exactly where the fault for the entire affair truly lay. Reginald, faced with the Duke's open disapproval and the county's swift shift in sympathy, found himself with little choice but to withdraw entirely from local society for a time, his own reputation suffering considerably more than Clara's ever had. Lady Margaret, delighted by the resolution, insisted on hosting a gathering to celebrate what she called, with a knowing smile, the restoration of good sense to my nephew's household, and it was there, beneath the same lanterns that had witnessed Edmund's first quiet admission of feeling weeks before, that he asked Clara to walk with him once more to the edge of the garden. "I have something to ask you," he said, "and I find myself considerably more nervous than I was the first night we argued, which I did not think possible." Clara's heart began to race, some instinct telling her exactly what was coming. Then ask, and let us discover together whether the nervousness was warranted. Edmund knelt, there among the roses, and Clara felt the entire evening narrow down to this single moment, the music and laughter of the gathering fading into distant background noise. "Clara Whitfield," he said, "you argued with me before you knew my name, and you have continued arguing with me ever since, and I have come to understand that I do not wish to spend the rest of my life with anyone who would not do exactly the same. You have taught me more about honesty, about fairness, about the kind of man I wish to be, than any tutor or advisor ever managed in all my years before I met you. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and continuing to argue with me for however many years we are fortunate enough to share?" Clara laughed through fresh tears, the sound bright and full of joy. "Only if you promise to keep being wrong often enough to give me something to argue about." "I believe I can safely promise that," Edmund said, rising to slip a ring onto her finger, "given how frequently you have informed me of my errors so far." She kissed him then, there beneath the lanterns and the roses, and when they returned to the gathering hand in hand, the announcement that followed was met with such enthusiastic celebration that even Sir Walter, who had hoped for exactly this outcome since the very first night of their meeting, found himself entirely overcome with pride, embracing his daughter and shaking Edmund's hand with equal fervor. Beatrice wept happy tears into her handkerchief. Henry, thoroughly pleased with his own role in the affair, accepted congratulations from anyone who would offer them, as though the match had been entirely his doing. And Lady Margaret, watching the celebration with quiet satisfaction, allowed herself a rare moment of pure contentment, knowing that her nephew had found, in the sharp-tongued young woman who had once argued with him without knowing his name, exactly the kind of partner he had needed all along. News of the engagement reached the far corners of the county within days, and with it came a curious shift in the way people spoke of Clara. The same sharp tongue that had once drawn whispered criticism now celebrated as evidence of exceptional character, worthy of a duke's devoted attention. Clara found the reversal faintly amusing, having changed nothing whatsoever about herself in the intervening months, and remarked as much to Beatrice during one of their frequent visits in the weeks that followed. "It is remarkable," she said, "how quickly opinion shifts once a title becomes involved. I was called forward and unbecoming only months ago, by some of the very same women now praising my wit at every gathering I attend. People rarely admire boldness in the poor and unconnected," Beatrice said, not unkindly. "They save their admiration for boldness that has already proven itself successful. It says more of them than it ever did of you. I suppose I should simply be grateful the shift occurred at all, rather than dwelling on how little it reflects true change in anyone's thinking." "Grateful, and perhaps a little amused, as you clearly already are." Clara laughed, unable to disagree, and turned the conversation toward more pleasant matters, the endless small details of a wedding now only weeks away. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a pleasant blur of preparation, Clara's mother's old friends arriving to help with fittings, Lady Margaret overseeing the arrangement of flowers with the exacting standards of a woman who had planned a great many grand occasions in her lifetime, Sir Walter fretting over guest lists with an enthusiasm that bordered on the theatrical. Clara found herself, more than once, simply watching the preparations unfold around her with a kind of quiet disbelief, unable to fully accept that the chaos of the past months had led, ultimately, to this particular joy. "You seem distracted," Beatrice observed one afternoon as they sat together reviewing fabric samples for Clara's wedding gown. "I keep thinking of that first night," Clara admitted. "How thoroughly I disliked him. How certain I was that I would never think of him again once the evening ended. Fate has a curious sense of humor, it seems." "It does indeed, though I confess I would not trade a single moment of it, difficult as some of those moments were." Henry, for his part, took considerable pride in reminding anyone who would listen that he had personally ridden to Wren Hollow to set matters right, embellishing the tale with each retelling, until Clara finally threatened, half in jest, to bar him from the wedding entirely if he did not moderate his account. He laughed at the threat and continued the embellishments regardless, delighted beyond measure at his role in his sister's happiness. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, and Clara stood before the mirror in her old bedroom, dressed in white, feeling for a moment the full weight of everything that had brought her to this day. The argument, the doubt, the reconciliation, the slow and steady building of a partnership founded on honesty rather than convenience. Her father, when he came to collect her for the walk to the church, could not speak for a long moment, simply staring at his daughter with tears standing openly in his eyes. "Your mother would have been so proud," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said the right match was the one that challenged you, not the one that simply agreed with everything you said. I think she would have liked Edmund, Clara said softly. I think she would have liked him a great deal. The ceremony itself passed in a haze of happiness. Clara would struggle, later, to describe in any detail beyond the essential facts. The vows exchanged, the ring placed upon her finger, Edmund's steady voice promising devotion before the assembled guests. What she remembered most clearly, when she thought back on the day in later years, was not the ceremony itself, but the moment immediately after, when Edmund had leaned close to whisper something meant only for her. I am the luckiest man in this county, he had said, to have found a woman willing to tell me I was wrong before she ever knew my name. The wedding, when it came that autumn, was the talk of the county for months afterward, though Clara, standing at Edmund's side as they exchanged their vows, cared little for the gossip and celebration surrounding them. She cared only for the man beside her, the one who had once been nothing more than a rude stranger at a gathering, and who had become, through the strangest and most unlikely of beginnings, the truest partner she could have imagined. A year into their marriage, Clara stood in the study at Wren Hollow, reviewing a stack of papers that had, over the preceding months, become as familiar to her as any book she had ever read. Edmund had made good on his promise from the garden that summer, the reforms to the tenant farms now well underway, and Clara had taken an active role in shaping them, her opinions no longer merely tolerated, but actively sought out by a husband who had learned, through months of marriage, that her instincts about fairness were rarely wrong. The Hargrove family has written again, she said, glancing up as Edmund entered the room, shrugging off his riding coat after an afternoon spent surveying the eastern fields. They wish to thank you for the new arrangement regarding their lease. Apparently their eldest son will now be able to attend school in the village, something they could not previously afford. Our arrangement, Edmund corrected, crossing to stand behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders as he read over the letter. You drafted half these terms yourself, Clara. I merely signed my name to them. Your name carries considerably more weight than mine ever could, in matters such as these. My name carries weight because people know I married a woman who refuses to let injustice pass unremarked. That reputation is yours as much as mine. Clara smiled, setting the letter aside, and turned in her chair to look up at him properly. In the years since their wedding, she had watched Edmund grow steadily more comfortable in the role he had once worn so awkwardly, no longer the guarded, arrogant stranger she had first encountered, but a man who had learned to temper his convictions with genuine curiosity about the world beyond his own experience. She liked to think she had played some small part in that transformation, though she suspected he had simply needed someone willing to challenge him until the better parts of his character emerged on their own. The reforms to the tenant farms did not proceed without difficulty. That first winter brought a harsh frost that threatened several of the smaller harvests, and Clara found herself, alongside Edmund, riding out through bitter cold to assess the damage personally, rather than waiting for reports to arrive secondhand. We cannot simply extend more credit to every family that struggles, Edmund said one evening, poring over the estate ledgers with a furrowed brow. The estate itself would not survive such generosity indefinitely, however much I wish otherwise. No one is asking for indefinite generosity, Clara replied, studying the figures over his shoulder. But the Amberley family lost nearly a third of their crop to the frost, through no fault of their own. A single season's reduction in their lease is not generosity, Edmund. It is simple fairness, given the circumstances beyond their control. And if every family makes a similar claim, whether or not the circumstances truly warrant it, then you assess each claim individually, as any reasonable landlord would, rather than assuming dishonesty as your first response. You know these families now, Edmund. You have walked their fields and spoken with them directly. Trust what you have learned of their character, rather than defaulting to suspicion out of habit. Edmund considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. You are right, as you so often are. Forgive me. I fear I sometimes still think like my father did, however much I try not to. That is precisely why you must keep trying, Clara said gently, resting her hand on his shoulder. The trying is what matters, not the occasional slip backward. By spring, the reforms had taken firmer shape, a system of fair assessment that accounted for genuine hardship without inviting abuse, and the tenant families, who had watched the young Duke and his wife with cautious hope through the difficult winter, began speaking of them with a warmth that spread steadily through the county's more humble households, if not always through its grander drawing rooms. Lady Margaret visited often that year, delighting in what she called the improvement of her nephew's disposition, though she took every opportunity to remind Clara that she deserved considerable credit for engineering it. You have done what I never managed in all his years growing up, Lady Margaret said one afternoon, as the three of them sat together in the drawing room. You have made him listen. He was always capable of listening, Clara said. He simply needed a reason to believe it was worth doing. And you provided that reason by refusing to back down from him, even when it would have been considerably easier to simply agree. Edmund, overhearing from across the room, offered a dry smile. You make me sound entirely helpless in the matter, Aunt Margaret, as though I contributed nothing to my own improvement. You contributed the good sense to marry her, Edmund. I consider that contribution sufficient. The laughter that followed was warm and easy, the kind that had become common in the household over the past year, and Clara found herself, in quiet moments like these, marveling at how completely her life had changed since the night she had argued with a rude stranger without knowing his name. Reginald Price, she learned some months into the marriage, had eventually left the county entirely, unable to rebuild the reputation his own jealousy had cost him, settling instead in a distant town where his history was not so widely known. Clara felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, though she could not deny a certain relief that his presence no longer shadowed her happiness, nor any lingering doubt he might have sought to plant between herself and Edmund. Henry, meanwhile, had become something of a fixture at Wren Hollow, visiting so frequently that Edmund had taken to joking he ought simply to move in permanently and spare everyone the trouble of his constant comings and goings. Clara suspected her brother's frequent visits had less to do with sisterly devotion and more to do with a particular fondness he had developed for Wren Hollow's head housemaid, a quick-witted young woman named Alice who had, on more than one occasion, been observed laughing rather too easily at Henry's jokes for the encounter to be purely coincidental. Clara said nothing of her suspicions for many months, content to let her brother discover his own feelings in his own time, as she had once been allowed to discover hers. It was Lady Margaret, characteristically direct, who finally forced the matter into the open, cornering Henry during one of his visits with a bluntness that left him stammering. You have visited this house 11 times in the past month, Lady Margaret informed him, counting the figure off with obvious satisfaction at having kept track. I do not believe my nephew's company alone accounts for such devotion. I enjoy my sister's company as well, Henry protested weakly. Your sister is occupied with estate matters more often than not these days, and yet still you find reasons to linger in the servants' corridor near the kitchen gardens. I am neither blind nor foolish, young man, whatever you may believe of an old woman's powers of observation. Henry's ears turned a deep shade of red, and by the following spring, he had worked up sufficient courage to formally request Alice's hand, a match that delighted Clara nearly as much as her own had, given how thoroughly her brother had championed her own happiness only a year before. Sir Walter grumbled briefly about the difference in station before Clara reminded him, rather pointedly, that he had raised no such objections when a duke came calling for his daughter, and the grumbling ceased soon after. You are smiling, Edmund observed one evening, finding Clara at the window of their bedroom, watching the last light fade over the gardens below. What are you thinking of? I was thinking of the night we met, she admitted. How thoroughly I disliked you, for those first few minutes, before I even knew your name. I remember it clearly. You told me I confused honesty with arrogance. You did confuse the two, at the time. I did, he agreed, coming to stand beside her, his arms settling around her waist as they both looked out over the grounds together. I am grateful, every day, that you were honest enough to tell me so, rather than simply allowing me to remain exactly as insufferable as I was that evening. Someone had to do it, Clara said, leaning into him. I merely happened to be the one brave enough, or perhaps simply reckless enough, to speak the truth aloud. Whichever it was, I am endlessly thankful for it. They stood together in comfortable silence as darkness settled fully over Wren Hollow, the estate that had once felt so unfamiliar to Clara, now entirely and completely her home. She thought, sometimes, of how different her life might have been had she simply walked away that first night, had she chosen politeness over honesty, and let the stranger's wrong opinion pass unchallenged. She was glad, endlessly glad, that she had not. Their daughter was born the following spring, a small, fierce creature who announced her arrival with a cry loud enough to be heard throughout the entire East Wing, and whom Edmund declared, within moments of her birth, to possess exactly her mother's stubborn temperament. She will argue with everyone she meets, he said, cradling the infant with a tenderness that still occasionally caught Clara by surprise, given how guarded he had once been. I can already tell. Good, Clara said, watching the two of them together with a fullness of heart she had never quite managed to put into words. The world could use a few more people willing to argue when arguing is warranted. Lady Margaret, upon meeting her newest relation, declared the child's temperament a considerable improvement upon her father's, at a similar age, a remark that earned her a mock-offended protest from Edmund, and a delighted laugh from Clara, who found herself, in that small, ordinary moment, more content than she had ever imagined possible, on the night a rude stranger had first caught her attention across a crowded ballroom. 2 years later, a second child arrived, a son this time, quieter than his sister but no less determined once he had settled on a particular course of action, and the household at Wren Hollow grew steadily louder and more chaotic with each passing season, filled with the sound of small feet racing through corridors that had once, in Edmund's father's time, known only silence and formality. "I do not think this house has ever been so full of noise," Edmund remarked one evening, watching their daughter attempt to teach her younger brother a game whose rules seemed to shift according to her own convenience whenever he came close to winning. "Is that a complaint?" "Very much the opposite. I spent my own childhood in rooms too quiet and too large, wandering corridors that echoed with nothing but my own footsteps. I would not trade this noise for anything, however tired it occasionally leaves me." Clara leaned against him, watching their children with a fondness that had only deepened with each passing year. "Nor would I, though I confess I did not always imagine my life unfolding quite this way, back when I was a girl dreaming of adventures beyond this county's borders." "And does this feel like a disappointment then, compared to those girlhood dreams?" "Not in the slightest," Clara said, turning to press a kiss to his cheek. "I simply never imagined the adventure would begin with an argument about idleness and poverty, at a ballroom gathering I very nearly did not attend at all. Having told my father that evening I found such gatherings tiresome, and would rather stay home with a book." Edmund laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in a way that had become entirely familiar over their years together. "Then I owe your father a considerable debt, for whatever persuasion convinced you to attend that particular evening." "You owe him nothing. I attended because Beatrice threatened to visit me twice as often if I refused, and I judged the ballroom the lesser trial of the two options available to me." "A romantic beginning indeed." "The most romantic beginnings," Clara said, smiling up at him, "are rarely the ones we plan in advance. They are simply the ones we are fortunate enough to recognize, once they have already begun. Not every season passed without difficulty." A fever swept through the county the following winter, striking several households including their own, and Clara spent 3 anxious nights at their son's bedside, while the physician came and went with grave expressions that gave little comfort. Edmund scarcely left her side through those long nights, and when the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, leaving their son weak but recovering, Clara wept openly in her husband's arms. The fear of those days finally permitted release now that the danger had passed. "I do not know what I would have done," she said, her voice still shaking, "had we lost him." "We did not lose him," Edmund said firmly, holding her close. "And whatever trials come next, we will face them exactly as we have faced everything else since that first ridiculous argument. Together, and honestly, and without pretending to each other that the fear does not exist." It was, Clara thought later, a fitting summary of everything their marriage had become, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence, always, of someone willing to face difficulty alongside her, without flinching from the truth of how hard certain seasons could be. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask how her parents had met, Clara would tell the story with a particular fondness, describing the argument that had begun it all, the fury she had felt at a stranger's dismissive opinions, the shock of discovering he was a duke only hours later. She never softened the story for the telling, never pretended the beginning had been anything other than what it was: 2 stubborn people, unwilling to back down, who had found, in their unwillingness to agree, the very foundation upon which something lasting and true had eventually been built. "Did you know, that first night, that you would marry him?" their daughter asked once, wide-eyed with the particular wonder of a child hearing a favorite story. "I knew nothing of the sort," Clara said, smiling at the memory. "I only knew that I was right, and that he was wrong, and that I intended to tell him so whether he wished to hear it or not. Everything else followed from there, in ways I could never have predicted, and would not have changed for anything in the world." And so it was that Clara and Edmund's story, which had begun with an argument between strangers who did not yet know each other's names, became instead the foundation of a partnership built on honesty, on the courage to speak difficult truths, and on the rare, precious understanding that the person willing to challenge you is often the very person worth keeping closest for the whole of your life. Sir Walter lived long enough to see both his grandchildren grow past their earliest years, spending his final seasons dividing his time contentedly between his own quiet household and the ever-lively halls of Wren Hollow, where he had become something of a fixture at Sunday dinners, regaling anyone who would listen with increasingly embellished accounts of the night his daughter had unknowingly argued with a duke. Clara never corrected the embellishments, finding a particular tenderness in watching her father take such evident joy in a story that had once caused her so much anxious uncertainty. On the 10th anniversary of that first argument, Edmund arranged a small gathering at Wren Hollow, inviting only the closest circle of family and friends who had witnessed the story unfold from its earliest, most uncertain days. Beatrice arrived with her own husband, a quiet gentleman she had married 2 years after Clara's own wedding, and Henry brought Alice and their growing family, the children immediately racing off to join their cousins in whatever mischief the gardens might offer that afternoon. 10 years, Lady Margaret said, raising her glass with the satisfaction of a woman who had watched the entire affair unfold from its very beginning. 10 years since a rude stranger met his match in a ballroom and had the good sense eventually to marry her. Eventually, Edmund agreed, smiling at Clara across the table, being the operative word, given how thoroughly I nearly ruined everything through my own foolish pride. You corrected the error quickly enough. In the end, Clara said, reaching for his hand. That is what matters most, I think. Not that mistakes occur, but that we find our way back from them, honestly and without pretense. A fitting philosophy, Lady Margaret said, for two people who built an entire marriage from nothing more than a disagreement about idleness and poverty. The table erupted into laughter, the familiar story told once more among people who loved them, and Clara, watching her family gathered together beneath the same lanterns that had witnessed so much of her own story, felt a contentment so complete she could scarcely find words to describe it, even to herself. She thought, as she often did on quiet evenings like this one, of the girl she had been that first night, certain of her own rightness, unaware that the man she was arguing with would one day become the truest partner of her life. She would not have changed a single word of that first heated exchange, not the fury nor the stubbornness nor the refusal to back down, for it had led her, however improbably, to exactly the life she had not known to hope for.